So welcome to the podcast. Here on my first episode, I'm excited to bring in track and sprint coach Cody BIDLOW. Cody, thanks for coming on. I'm excited to hear from you today on speed development and everything that entails speed. Can you just give us just maybe a brief introduction on who you are and what you do?
Yeah, for sure. So my name's Cody BIDLOW. I'm known online as AthleteX. I come from a track and field and team sport background as far as being an athlete myself. I ran track at the Division I level in college. Then after that, I got into coaching individual athletes. Currently, I coach at a high school in Phoenix, Arizona. I've coached at Santa Barbara City College, a few other gigs that I've had. But over time, I've just become really passionate about trying to solve the puzzle that is, how do we make people faster? I still compete as a track and field athlete myself. And so between my own athletic pursuits and in trying to make people better with the athletes that I coach, I've come to find that there's just, a lot of good information out there, but there's also, I feel, some mixed messages as far as what it takes to actually make people faster. And in the world of training athletes, developing speed is one of the hardest things to do. That's why there's only a few people who have run, 9.7 or faster in the 100-meter dash. So I see it as a puzzle, an ever-evolving puzzle, and it just really piques my interest. And so over time, I've dedicated my life basically to trying to learn how to get faster myself, how to make athletes that I coach faster, and then through my YouTube channel, website, and all that, I try to share that information as much as I can, because when I was coming up as an athlete, there really was just a lack of information out there. So I want to try and help people, in their own athletic pursuits, whether that's with a team sport or they're a track athlete, whatever it may be, just really share as much information as I can to help people achieve their best. And it's fun to run fast, so that's kind of what I do.
Yeah, great. I to your point about there not being a lot of information out there, and I think now there is.
Yep.
So one of the first things I wanted to ask you was, what are some common myths or misconceptions around speed development? Because there is a lot of information online, especially social media and certain videos that go viral or things like that. So one of the first things I wanted to ask you are, okay, what are some things that athletes should look out for, or things not to do in regards to speed development?
I think the first thing to consider is that to make someone faster, you have to run fast. You can't get faster by simply doing a bunch of 400-meter repeats, doing a really high training volume of running, a lot of slower running. You have to run fast in order to give your body the stimulus that it needs to adapt to that specific thing you're trying to do. If you're trying to get stronger, you don't go lift a 5-pound weight. You lift heavy weights, and that's how you get stronger. Well, if we want to run fast, we have to train fast, whether that's on the track, on the field, in the gym. And I see a lot of coaches, especially at the high school level with track and field, or football coaches, basketball coaches, where their conditioning or the running training that they're doing is much slower than it needs to be to run fast. And they're doing a lot more training volume. They're running so much that their bodies never have the ability to really adapt in the direction we want it to as far as getting faster. If you're not running at a certain percentage of your maximal velocity, you're not giving your body the stimulus or the signals that it needs to run faster. Another thing that I find is pretty common is a lot of coaches will tell their athletes, okay, when we're accelerating, you got to get low, you got to stay low. Well, your ability to project out at a low angle is going to be limited by your force production capabilities. So if you're a 14-year-old freshman athlete who hasn't done any strength and conditioning, hasn't done a lot of training, you're only going to be able to launch out at a certain angle. So oftentimes when coaches tell their athletes, oh, you got to fire out really low, if they're not strong enough to handle that, what are they going to do? They're going to reach out in front of them. They're going to put the brakes on because they're overstriding. Then they're going to pop straight up. And now you have the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. So sometimes it's cues that I think, they're well-intentioned. The coach is trying to give them something that's good to do. But if you focus too much on staying low, or you do a lot of running, or things like low heel recovery, those things are useful for individual athletes in certain circumstances, but I find they're typically misapplied to athletes. So they're either running too much, or they're trying to do something that they're simply not capable of. So those are kind of some of the common things that I see go wrong in people's training with regards to trying to run faster.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I think in training the athletes that I train, and I typically train, youth to high school and college athletes are typically who I train, and a lot of them don't understand kind of what you said about, hey, to get fast, you have to run fast.
Yep.
They don't understand what that means. And so, in practice or oftentimes in practice or even in games, you may not really hit your true max speed. And so you mentioned get fast or run fast, which I think is simple, but, coming to, a structured training session to work on your speed specifically, I don't think athletes understand that running at max velocity is a very, very high and demanding exercise for the nervous system, neuromuscularly. So I think a lot of high school athletes don't really understand, run fast to get fast is simple to say, but actually doing that and doing that consistently and committing to, hey, I'm going to have a structured speed session where I'm going to run as fast as I can. I think there's value to that, as you mentioned. So I don't know, maybe can you speak on that a little bit of the demands of high-speed sprinting and how important that is?
Yeah, for sure. So when you're sprinting near maximal velocity or just even at a maximal intensity, whether you reach maximal velocity in a sprint is going to depend on if you're running a long enough distance to reach it. But whether you're running a 20-meter sprint, 40-meter sprint, 60, whatever it is, if we really want to get faster, the intent has to be there to run as fast as you can. Now, sometimes people feel like, oh, I'm running pretty fast, but to really run all out is a very demanding thing on your body. Your nervous system has to coordinate, contraction and relaxation between different muscle fibers, between different muscle groups. You have to be able to activate a lot of tissue throughout your body very rapidly, relax certain muscles in a certain coordinated fashion, and you can only learn that by exposing yourself to that specific form of work. The flip side is that if you're running all out, you can only do so much of it. So a coach or an athlete might think, oh, okay, I'm going to go do sprint work. I need to be tired by the end of it. Well, the type of fatigue or the feeling that you're going to have at the end of a session where you're developing maximal speed or maximal acceleration capabilities is not the same type of fatigue that you'll feel when you go do 400-meter repeats. So as an athlete, if you're trying to run faster and you're out there training by yourself or you're coaching athletes, you have to understand that to create enough of a stress on the body, because all training that we do, we're creating a certain type of stress so that our body will adapt to handle that stress better the next time we do it. So if we apply the stress of sprinting very fast, you have to understand that there's only so many sprints you can do before you're now going to start, A, getting very fatigued, B, your movement quality is going to go down. You're not going to be able to have the right technique. And you're going to get to a point where you're no longer running fast enough to cause adaptation. So if you're truly trying to run faster, you have to think of, okay, I'm going to go out, get a very good warm-up. I want to get maybe 3 to 10 sprints in as fast as I can run them with a good recovery in between. You don't want to go do a really fast sprint and only recover for 30 seconds and try to do that again because you're not going to be able to run very fast after that short rest. And you have to be okay with understanding that it doesn't take a lot of overall work to make you faster, but it has to be very targeted, very high quality work where you're focusing on hitting the ground very aggressively and keeping your posture right and moving as fast as you can. And if you do that, if you're a high school athlete, junior high, collegiate athlete, whatever it is, you're going to get benefits out of that. But if you go into the workout trying to get yourself tired, trying to do so much work that by the end of it you just feel exhausted, that's not where we want to go with our sprint training, you know? But it's very common to see, okay, we want to do gassers at the end of practice, or we're going to do shuttles. That's totally fine. But if that's the only thing you're doing,
you're not going to get faster.
No. You're not exposing yourself to the demands of maximal effort sprinting.
Right, which I think a lot of, sport coaches, a basketball coach, a football coach, they don't understand.
Yeah.
And then the athletes they're being run into the ground, and then they're wondering why they're not getting faster. Mm-hmm. So I think the athletes that I train and that you train, I think it's important for me at least to get the message across. Like you said, hey, we have to run really, really fast. We have to recover between reps. And the overall volume, at least initially, is not that high.
Right.
You mentioned, hey, maybe 3 to 10 sprints. Mm-hmm. And then we're done. So keeping the quality really, really high and the overall volume low. And obviously you build volume over time as your body adapts, and you need to continue to provide it a stimulus to adapt to. But to your point, not an overall a lot of work, but understanding the quality is really important. I would say my next question is, what are 3 simple things an athlete can do right now on their own to get faster?
Well, I think one of the key things we have to think about when we're trying to run faster is we have to have the right posture. So what do I mean by posture? Our pelvic position, our spine, we have to be in a pretty neutral overall position. We don't want to be leaning forward, leaning back. We don't want our pelvis to be tilted super far forward or super far back, because our legs are attached to our pelvis and our torso. So if those are out of alignment, you're not going to be able to hit the ground very well and produce a lot of force when you're on the ground. Once your pelvis and your spine is in a good position, it's not anything super crazy you have to do. It's just you want to be in a neutral position. Gravity's pulling you straight down, so you want to be in a pretty straight up and down position. Once you're into your running, say you're at 20 meters, 30 meters, and you're sprinting for a 60-meter sprint, you want to be in a nice, very upright position. Then from there, it comes down to rapidly attacking the ground, but not pushing behind you for too long, not reaching out in front of you. It's all about bring the foot up and set it down under you. And if you can do that very rapidly, it'll almost feel like you're tapping the ground with your feet. That's what's going to set you up to run fast. Like if you have good posture and good ground contact mechanics, that's the bulk of what makes us run fast. If we can produce a lot of force on the ground in a very short period of time, and we hit the ground in the right spot, which is generally under our body, that's what's going to lead to us running as fast as possible. So once you have your postures in a good place and you're in a pretty neutral position, you're sprinting down the track or the field, then it comes down to how well you can attack the ground. And when you're sprinting, it shouldn't feel like you're pushing behind yourself too much. And that's one of the most common mistakes that I see athletes make, whether on my track team or the kids that I train, is they try to run down the track straight forward in front of them by pushing straight back behind them. But you have to consider, what is the biggest force that we're working against in sprinting? It's gravity. And what direction does gravity pull us? Straight down. So if we push ourselves straight forward by pushing backward into the track and gravity's pulling us down, the net result of that is we're going to start crashing down into the ground. Our feet are going to be smashing forward into the ground, which is going to create braking forces, and it's going to slow us down. So what we want to do is we want to work to overcome gravity, because that's the number one force that we have to overcome in sprinting. So we have to apply a lot of vertically directed forces into the ground very rapidly, and that's ultimately what makes people really fast, is their ability to attack the ground vertically very fast. Once you've built up momentum from acceleration, it's all about vertical force production. So that's why we want to get into a nice upright posture, because then we're in line with gravity, and then we can attack straight down under our body, hit the ground, and then immediately let that leg recover so we can get into the next stride. And if you push behind yourself too much horizontally, like you're trying to push the ground away from you behind you, and you're doing that in upright sprinting, oftentimes you'll find that athletes can't get their knees up high enough. They can't reorient the leg to the front side to then attack the ground again in a good way. And they end up kind of just falling their way down the track, crashing the whole way. And that's probably the number one technical issue that I encounter with track and field athletes, football players, and that sort of thing.
Particularly in upright running.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that kind of gets lost, attacking the ground vertically, because there's a big discussion between horizontal and vertical. Right. And so I think you're referring to more in upright sprinting. After acceleration, you transition into max velocity. What about acceleration? What are some key points for an athlete to understand of how do I accelerate faster? Because I feel like a lot of athletes ask me, hey, how do I get faster in my first 3 steps, which is really important in team sport. Athletes, basketball, volleyball, even baseball, football, lacrosse. I think that's really important is first step. Quickness is kind of like, a term people use a lot. So practically, can you kind of describe acceleration, how it applies to maybe a team sport athlete, but also track, but particularly team sport athlete? And what do I need to do to accelerate well?
So I think the themes are similar. It's just that instead of being in an upright position, we're in sort of a forward-oriented position where our chest is in front of our hips. We're kind of leaning forward, so to speak. We still want to be attacking in line with the body. So what does that mean? Well, instead of striking straight down under us, we're going to be driving our legs sort of a little bit down and back under our body when we're accelerating. When we accelerate, we have a little bit more time on the ground and a little bit less time in the air. So you'll feel quicker because you're on the ground, you push yourself across the ground, then you have that next step, and you're not spending a lot of time in the air. So you want to take advantage of the opportunity to push a little bit harder in acceleration, and that's where a cue like push the ground away from you might be more beneficial because you have the time and the body positioning to benefit from that. So we want to get into a good alignment with our body. We want to be leaning forward, but we don't want to have our torso leaning down toward the ground lower than the angle that our legs are producing when we're pushing off the ground. We don't want to be bent over at the hips. We still want to be in that nice elongated position.
Back to your point about posture.
Exactly.
As well, yeah.
So the posture really stays the same throughout the sprint. It goes from being angled forward to being straight up and down. But there's never a bend at the hips in any point of the sprint, really. We want to drive our knees forward and then attack back under our body, attack back at the track or attack back at the ground under your hips. You don't want to reach out in front of the body. If you're reaching out in front, you might be trying to go too low. What happens if we reach out in front? Well, we'll probably crash our foot into the ground.
It's a break.
And we'll slow down. Exactly. That's what we do to change direction.
Right.
Because we want to slow down and change direction. Well, we don't want to do that when we're sprinting and trying to accelerate. You want to feel a little bit more powerful, I would say, in acceleration, like you're spending a little bit more time on the ground so you can produce a lot more force. But pretty soon after you take those first few steps and you attack back under your hips, you're going to start to rise. And you want to let your body rise. You don't want to hold yourself down, staying low the whole way. You will be low in the first few steps, but pretty quickly your body's going to rise into an upright position.
Right.
If you think of a team sport athlete, they're accelerating and then they have to do something, whether that's take on a block, look for the football, something like that. It doesn't benefit you to just stay low for 50 yards because then you're taking yourself out of the play. So we want to push aggressively. We want to let your knee drop a little bit so you have a forward-oriented shin angle. So you
out
can,
of the start.
Exactly. So you can push at the right angle that we want to get. You know, if we want to go that way, our shin probably needs to be pointing in that direction for us to go that way. But after a few steps, you'll want to be letting your body rise into an upright position so you can either make a cut, look for the ball, look for a defender, whatever it is that you need to do. But I think it comes back to, feeling yourself just push aggressively, push quickly, and attack under your body. You don't want to be out in front of your body too much, and you don't want to be pushing behind yourself too much. And whether you're in acceleration or upright sprinting, those two key factors are going to be the same either way. It's just that you're in a more forward-oriented position or a more upright position.
Right. And so maybe put simply, for an athlete listening to this, what are a couple of things they can do to become a better accelerator as far as drills or anything like that? Now, I know, being, putting yourself into a well thought out overall program is important, but really simply maybe what are some drills that some athletes can do that can help them run faster, right now, like accelerating on the first 3 steps?
Well, I think doing, hill sprints, sled pulls, things like that are going to help teach you what it feels like to push in that more forward-oriented position. It slows it down a little bit, so you're able to feel your shin drop to a lower angle, feel yourself project out a little bit more, whereas they aren't necessarily going to make you faster right away, but they can help teach you, give you context for what it should feel like, and then when you take that sled off or you go to a flat, surface after running on the hill, you might be able to take that feeling you had on the hill or with the sled and apply it to that sprint. And then as you do sled pulls or hill sprints over time, then you'll develop better force production capabilities and you really hone that in. And over time, it'll transfer to you being able to accelerate faster. I think getting stronger, so like the athletes who come to you for your strength and conditioning work, getting stronger is a great way to improve acceleration because ultimately what we're doing in acceleration is overcoming inertia and generating momentum. And to do that, you have to be able to produce force. Easiest way to produce more force is to get stronger. So oftentimes I'll find that simply by training it, simply doing it, you just go out and do sprints. Maybe you film yourself so you can look and see, okay, are my shin angles good? Is my posture good? Am I attacking back at the track or is my foot crashing forward and I'm braking? Just looking for those very basic aspects of technique. If you over time, you're able to do a lot of sprints. You come into the gym here and you get stronger. That's really the equation for improving your acceleration. It doesn't require anything that's outside of, some fancy drill or some. It really is simple. You do sprints, short sprints, repeated. You do them many times over a long period of time. You get stronger in the gym and you're going to get better. And then, like I said, if you look at yourself on video and you're just looking for those basic things like, do I have good posture? And am I attacking back at the ground actively? I'm not waiting for the ground. I'm actually attacking the ground. That's what's going to make you run faster. And it's easier to sell, this piece of equipment or this, fancy drill. If you buy my ebook, it'll tell you everything. But at the end of the day, our bodies are the best adaptive mechanisms there are on the planet. And if we just do the thing we're trying to get better at, we hone that skill, even if it's boring and monotonous. It's not boring for me because I love it, but it may be boring for someone. But that's what you have to do.
Yeah.
If you want to get better at jumping, you got to jump a lot.
Right. And I use that analogy a lot with the athletes that I train. It's like, hey, what's the best way to become a great putter in golf? What's the best way to become a great free throw shooter? What do you have to do?
Yeah.
Well, you got to shoot free throws, and you have to do it often. You have to do it all the time.
Yep.
And so with speed, put simply, I think it's generally the same. How do you get faster? You have to go run fast consistently. And I think we already touched on this, but it's kind of a foreign concept to athletes that are so structured, especially with travel and club and how busy, even youth athletes are. It's so structured that, having them come here and, hey, we're going to do hill sprints at maximum effort with maximum rest time, as hard as you can go. We're talking about technique and we're slowing things down, in terms of learning, but we're going to run really fast. It's kind of foreign.
Yeah.
So I like how you put, look, it's just really simple. Run really fast and get really strong. I think especially for youth athletes who have a low training age, I think that's, really important.
Yep.
So can you kind of describe the differences between the different kind of speed methodologies or the different kind of concepts behind speed development? I know that there's short to long, there's long to short. What would you recommend and why?
Yeah, so I think for team sport athletes, for short sprint athletes, so people who run the 100 or the 200, or football players, soccer players, I think a short to long approach is the best way to go. And what we mean by short to long is you train shorter sprints first, and then over time you progress toward longer sprints. Back in the day and at a lot of schools, they train with a long to short approach where they start the year off doing a lot of long running, basically, 400 repeats, 600s, things like that. And then over time they make it faster, and then by the end of the season they're working on short sprints. Well, from my view, sprinting and real true sprinting, the fast sprinting we want to see in a 40-yard dash or a 100-meter sprint, it's very technical. It's a very unique ability that we're trying to develop. We need to start with a very short sprint because every 100-meter sprint, 200-meter sprint, 40-yard dash starts with acceleration. So in a short to long program, you start by developing acceleration. That could be 10s, 20s, 30s, something like that. Then as you see the athlete's technical ability and their ability to handle moving at a certain velocity improve, then you can lengthen it out and make the training more stressful by adding distance, which is going to make the average speed of that rep higher. They're going to have to handle higher velocities. Their muscles are going to have to handle higher levels of tension. And so to me, it makes logical sense that you would start with shorter sprints, which are a little bit slower, even though the intensity or the intent is maximal. You're trying to run as fast as you can. You're going to be running slower at 5 meters than you are at 30 meters. But the general gist of it is that we want to start with working on the very initial parts of the sprint. So getting off the line, getting to 5 meters, 10 meters, 20 meters, whatever it may be. Those velocities that you're running at are going to be a little bit lower. So as you introduce training into someone's, year-round training program, they can start with something that's a little bit easier to handle from a velocity standpoint, from a muscle tension standpoint, and they can work on the technique of initiating the sprint, of accelerating. Then as you develop those abilities to accelerate, then it's a natural progression into top speed development because now you're good at accelerating. Now you can accelerate to top speed, and now we can work that quality. Whereas a lot of coaches will do a long to short program where they spend most of the year doing, general conditioning, long runs, things like that. And then they only prioritize speed for a short period of time, and they wonder why their athletes get hurt or why they aren't performing well when it matters. Developing speed is something that has to be done as a year-round, training approach because it's a very unique skill that is hard to develop and hard to maintain. So we have to do it frequently. And the best way to do it frequently is to start with short sprints, make them a little bit longer over time, and you just progress a little bit by a little bit. So then you might start the year out doing 5s and 10s. And when you're ready to go to your combine for, the NFL combine or it's season for your football team or whatever it is, maybe you're up to doing 30s, 40s, 50s. They're running fast. They're used to running fast. So when they go out to the field and they catch a catch football and they got to run to the end zone, they're not going to pull a hamstring because they've been exposed to running fast so much that it's not something new to them. And so I think it really makes logical sense, especially for team sport athletes, do a short to long program where you're working on acceleration, then you progress to speed, maybe a little bit of longer speed or speed endurance, and you'll be good to go, you know?
Right. I think the longest short model falls short in speed development. Like you said, I don't know who says this, but speed grows like a tree. I mean, it takes time, it takes nurturing, it takes consistency. And so in a long to short, I think speed is lost oftentimes, particularly acceleration. So that's why I think, a long or a short to long is better in a lot of aspects, but particularly for, team sport athletes, they should be accelerating. They should be working on acceleration. As well as max velocity for the training stimulus in and of itself, but I think acceleration is key, and a short to long kind of just general approach I think is better. I want to get into plyometrics. I would say, a typical high school, football, baseball, basketball athlete, they generally, most of them want to lift, right? They want to go lift, they want to get strong. But I think as far as speed and power and explosiveness and becoming a better athlete, I think oftentimes plyometrics is missed because they don't know about it and they don't think it's important, and all they want to do is go lift. All they want to do is go lift and get strong, which I'm not against weightlifting and getting stronger. It's very important. But I think speed development is enhanced, obviously, by plyometrics, and I think high school athletes don't really understand that. So can you define what plyometrics is and how it affects speed development, or how important it is in terms of just becoming a better and more explosive athlete?
Yeah. I'm sure the exercise scientists out there will get mad at me for butchering this, but in my mind, the way I view plyometrics are, jumping, hopping activities where you have a very rapid transition from the eccentric, which is sort of the lengthening portion of a movement, sort of when you lower in a squat or when you land in a jump, a very rapid transition from that eccentric to the concentric where you're coming off the ground. And typically, in the past, plyometrics were viewed as things like depth jumps where you're dropping off a really high box, you hit the ground, you jump off the ground. Those are what I would call intensive plyometrics. They're very intense, hence the term. But there's also extensive plyometrics, which could be, pogo hops, it could be line hops, it could be little bouncy movements where you're just bouncing back and forth on the ground for a relatively high number of reps. And what that's going to do is help develop elasticity. So when we hit the ground in sprinting, we want to be able to bounce off the ground. That's one of my favorite cues, is you want to bounce as you're sprinting, especially in upright sprinting or top speed. By doing little low amplitude, so not very high, you're not jumping very high or very far, but you're able to get a high number of contacts in, doing low amplitude plyometrics like that, like pogo hops, line hops, side to side, forward, back. You could do them in a diamond shape, a square, whatever you want to get creative with. Doing stuff like that is going to help develop elasticity in the ankle, the foot, the knee, and that's going to allow you to hit the ground and bounce off the ground more effectively. When we sprint, if all we rely on is just muscular force, you may accelerate well, but you're not going to continue to accelerate to very high velocities, and you're not going to be very, very fast overall. To be very fast, you have to rely on your tendons, your fascia, to store energy, and if we don't develop those tissues, all we do is just lift weights, then we're not going to be exposed to things that can really, really make us faster.
And you're leaving a lot on the table.
Totally. And I think a lot of coaches jump too soon to intensive plyometrics, which I view as more of something that is like an expression of your ability, whereas the lower intensity plyometrics are what are going to help develop those abilities. And one thing that's sort of a side note is in sprinting, we use tempo runs. So for example, a tempo run is where you go out at maybe 70% effort, 50% effort, you run hundreds, 150s, they're not super fast. The goal is partially for conditioning, but part of the goal is also just to get a high number of low amplitude plyometric contacts in. If you can do 1,000 meters or 1,200 meters, 1,500 meters of tempo runs, it's not going to be very taxing on your nervous system, but you're going to get 700 ground contacts in that time. And that's going to be a very potent stimulus to develop elasticity and your ability to bounce your way down the track or down the field. And that's what's going to help you run with less effort when you're running down the field in your sport. So there's different ways that you can go about, viewing plyometrics or implementing plyometrics. But I think for younger athletes especially, don't get, too fancy or too intense with your plyometrics. Just do bouncy little hops. and work up to a really high training volume over time. You start with maybe 3 sets of 10, but 2 years down the road, maybe you're doing 3 sets of 30. And now you're able to bounce off the ground with very low effort. And what's going to happen when you go to sprint? It's going to be easier. You're going to use less energy to sprint. And then by the time you're in the fourth quarter of a football game, you're going to have more energy available to you because you're not just relying on contractile muscle tissue to push you down the field. You're able to bounce your way down it. So I think plyometrics are really useful. You just have to be careful with how much you do, and you have to progress it kind of very gradually over time, just like you want to progress your sprint training gradually over time. And I would view sprinting in itself as a plyometric activity.
Right. It's the ultimate plyometric.
Exactly.
Yep. I like how you are careful with volume and building work capacity for the athlete over time and just kind of slowly accumulating the ability to handle the load.
Yep.
And then for me, for youth athletes, I love plyometrics because, and this is a conversation we had earlier about kind of the just the commercialization of youth sports. They're not outside playing anymore. No. They're not in the playground as much. They're not, playing with their friends and wrestling and playing tag and all these things that develop that work capacity and that volume.
Yep.
So with the youth athletes that I train, I try to get away from their sport, and just say, hey, you're an athlete. Let's just develop athleticism. Let's run, hop, skip, jump, broad jump, skip for height, skip for distance. Let's jump as far as you can. Let's jump as high as you can, and kind of develop their volume in that sense, just to work on their athleticism, as opposed to, hey, you're a soccer player. Now let's develop you as an athlete, because I think that's something that is kind of missed now. Generally, I think with just how grueling really the schedule is for youth athletes in club and travel. And, by the time they're 13 or 14, they've played 300 games, and that kind of goes to burnout. And that's a totally different conversation. But in terms of plyometric, volume and how I utilize it, I like to just get youth and younger athletes, even high school athletes, get them moving. Get them jumping and sprinting and cutting and doing these things to develop athleticism.
Totally.
So I wanted to get into strength development a little bit, and how it affects speed or how it impacts speed. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of high school athletes that I train, all they want to do is lift, which again, I'm not against that. I love it. And I think you need to utilize it in the right way and use the right exercises and the right, volume and intensity and overload, and the right type of strength development or weightlifting. Can you get into that a little bit, and how do you see weightlifting and how does that affect speed, or how can you utilize the weight room to get faster?
For sure. So I try to look at, what stage is the athlete at in their athletic career? Are they someone who has never done any form of athletic activity? That person is going to need a very basic program of just learning how to move properly. Can they do a goblet squat? Can they lunge properly? Can they do a hinging movement? Can they rotate? Can they throw? Just building those basic movement patterns. Once we're past that initial phase, then I like to go into pretty simple movements, whether it's a hex bar deadlift, a squatting pattern, something like that, med ball throws for distance. Just something where you're learning to express force. When we lift weights, it's heavy, so we're learning to produce force. And what do we do on the track to run fast? We produce a lot of force in a very short period of time. Now, the stuff we do in the gym is always going to be slower than what we do on the track. And we prioritize in the gym things that are more force dominant, like a hex bar deadlift, a squat, to try and build the body's overall ability to produce force. And then by doing our sprint training, like when you go and do the hill sprints, sled pulls, 30s, whatever it may be, you're learning how to sprint properly and take that force production you've developed in the gym, learning how to apply it onto the ground by simply sprinting. And I think for the bulk of high school athletes, team sport athletes, the lifting doesn't have to be super fancy. You don't have to do a whole lot of it, but you have to make sure, once again, that it's good quality work. If you come in and all you're working is, 30% of your 1 rep max and you're doing 50 reps of that, it's probably not going to contribute to you getting much stronger, unless you're a very, introductory level athlete. So once you've developed those basic movement patterns, you've exposed yourself to a little bit of strength training, you've progressed it over time, then we want to shift more toward things that are taking into consideration the velocity demands of what we're doing. It doesn't mean that every lift we do is going to be light and fast, but you might start contrasting things, mixing different types of work into where maybe you do a heavier exercise followed by a lighter exercise, or you might mix in a squat followed by a jump or something like that. So you're kind of hitting both ends of that force velocity spectrum. You're hitting the thing that is more force dominant with the main lift. And then you're coming in with something a little bit more velocity dominant so that you're training the nervous system to take that force production capability and transfer it into something that's faster. Because I think the easiest thing to do in the world of, developing athletes, strength and conditioning, is to produce force. There's a reason there's way more people out there who can deadlift 400, 500 pounds than can go sprint at 11 meters per second.
It's different.
It's different. So I see the strength training side, especially for athletes who are not very late in their training career, or they don't have a really high training age. I think the strength and conditioning side of things with strength development is you can be pretty simple with it. You don't have to have 100 different exercises. You don't have to have super fancy exercises. I try to focus on, okay, what exercises are going to be very stable? So hex bar deadlift, very stable movement.
You can produce more force.
Exactly. And just by getting used to that, you're not only going to become a stronger athlete, which will help you produce more force when you sprint and run faster, it'll also sort of build your robustness or your ability to handle impacts or collisions or things like that. So if you're a football player, we want to get stronger not only for the performance side, but also from a health perspective.
Right.
Because one of the main reasons we lift is to prevent injury. There's a great podcast with Luis Mesquita, who is someone who I would suggest listening to. And he talked about that. He's like, one of the reasons that we lift with our elite track athletes is just so that they don't get hurt when they go hit the long jump board or when they're sprinting down the track coming off the bend in the 200. We want to prevent injury by making the body stronger as a whole. So when the athletes come in here and work with you, not only are you making them perform better because now they can produce more force when they hit the ground, or they can throw the ball further, or rotate more aggressively when they're swinging a bat, but they're also going to be less likely to get injured. So oftentimes with high school athletes, I find that some of them really like to lift. Some of them like to lift too much, and they like to go do a bunch of bodybuilding work, and then they come out to the track and they're kind of stiff and too much mass in their upper body for what we're trying to do in the 100-meter dash.
And they wonder why they're not fast.
Exactly. Because nothing that they're doing is, once again, it goes back to that quality idea. We don't want to come into the gym and do 100 reps at some low weight if we expect to get stronger and have that transfer to our sport. We need to lift heavy weight in a reasonable, moderate volume. So you're not doing that much work, but you're doing pretty intense work when you're doing it. That's what's going to transfer to their ability to perform. And it's also going to prevent injury because then their muscles, their joints, their bone density, all of that is going to be stronger.
And more resilient.
Exactly. More resilient, better able to handle the demands of sport. There's also hormonal effects. You'll have higher testosterone levels if you're lifting regularly. That's going to help your recovery. So there's a lot of reasons to lift. And for athletes that are a little hesitant to lift because, it's uncomfortable to put a bar on your back and squat. It kind of hurts your hand to pick up a hex bar deadlift or whatever it may be. But by doing that, you're going to reap benefits that down the road, as you get used to that, it'll become easier over time. What's heavy now will be light down the road. But as long as you can get through that and just trust in the process, it's really going to pay a lot of dividends down the road, because now when you're at the end of your season, you're going to have that just a better built body to handle all the demands of your sport, and you're going to perform better, be less likely to get injured, have a higher work capacity, and all those things are going to contribute to you being a better player in the fourth quarter or in the last games of the season when everything really counts.
Right, and I think there's more to it. It's simple, but there's also more to it than if I'm training a developing high school athlete. There's more to it than bench press, bicep curl, and dumbbell lateral raise. Look, there's more to it, especially if you want to become a better athlete. Mm-hmm. Nothing against those exercises, but I think you mentioned, not, trying to avoid the bodybuilding type exercises. And so for me, I think it's important to choose the right exercises and perform those exercises really, really well with high quality execution of technique. So what are some exercises just generally that you like, specifically geared towards becoming more explosive, faster, and more athletic?
Yeah, so my typical progression is I start out the year with things like goblet squats, lunges, good mornings with a med ball, low weight, just getting the athletes used to loading, used to doing certain movements. Then I try to load those movements over time. So we might go from a goblet squat to a parallel back squat, or a back squat slightly below parallel, or a box squat that is to a similar depth. Then over time I progress to shorter ranges of motion, because we have to consider, especially if you're working with speed. So I'm super biased to speed because I coach short sprinters. But we have to consider the time constraints of our sport. How long are we on the ground? How long do we have to produce force while we're on the ground? And how does our lifting, how relevant is it to that? So when I progress my training, I'm progressing toward things that are requiring me to produce force more rapidly. If I'm on the ground and I only have 100 milliseconds to produce force, but I'm doing a deep squat that takes 900 milliseconds to produce force, I'm training my nervous system to do something that's very different than what I want it to do on the track or on the field. So some coaches don't like to do partial ranges of motion, and I understand why. But I think if you get away from purely thinking about force production in a vacuum and you start to think of the time constraints under which we have to produce force in sport, then it starts to make more sense. If I progress from a parallel box squat to a half back squat to a quarter back squat, that quarter back squat, I can drop really fast, reverse it really fast. So I'm working on generating force as rapidly as I can. That'll be later in my progression, later in the year, more toward the competitive, period of the year. But earlier in the year, I'm using larger ranges of motion so that I'm developing the muscles at long lengths. I'm building the ability to move in different types of movements. And so I kind of progress things like that. With throwers, I might use more deadlifts, overhead press, things like that, and then progress into push press or something more explosive. But I just generally try to pick one of the major exercises you think of: back squat, deadlift, bench, whatever it may be. I don't get super fancy with those, but I try to progress how we're doing the exercise more than anything, and go from a slower, larger range of motion to a shorter, faster range of motion, but still pretty heavy along the way. And then toward the very end, I might deload everything and make it just very explosive, light, so that they're not fatigued and they can perform at their best toward the end of the year. But I'm always thinking about what are the time constraints of our sport, and how can I relate the stuff we do in the weight room to progress toward that.
Right. And I like how you kind of have that progression from general to specific.
Yep.
General physical preparation to specific physical preparation. So I think that's important for athletes to understand, is there needs to be a why behind the what. And you need to understand, time of year, loading, volume, intensity, progression. How does it relate to my sport? What are the angles that I see when I'm sprinting and running and cutting and jumping in my sport, and getting more specific to that. But I think people sometimes try to get too specific too soon.
Totally.
And especially for younger athletes and developing athletes, staying in the general phase for as long as we can and eke out as long as we can in the general phase, I think there's value to that. And just getting strong in general, like you said, to develop resiliency, of the actual, tissue, the bone, the tendon, the ligament, and just developing just general strength, I think is important. But then you have to get more specific. But I think for an athlete, understanding the why behind the what is really important, and having a qualified, coach to kind of take you on that journey and take you through a program, I think is really important. If the goal is to become a better athlete, if you just want to get bigger and stronger, then, you don't necessarily have to be that specific, but training to become a better athlete functionally, there's a little bit more to it. And that's kind of a battle that I fight constantly with the athletes that I train. We don't have to just come in and do the same things and just try to lift more weight, lift more weight, lift more weight. I do want to progressively overload, but just understanding going from general to specific in knee angles and load and speed and contraction velocity and things like that, I think is important.
And like you said, not going too specific too soon. As athletes, you have to understand, if you jump too quickly in your progression, where do you go from there? Where do you progress from there?
Right.
If you're going to a max, quarter squat with 600 pounds on your back and you're a junior in high school, well, how are you going to progress to get better your senior year going into college? We want to make sure that we're setting athletes up to progress over the long term so that they have the chance to continue to get better, and not just rush them to get better for our own sake so we can say, oh, look how well they performed this year. Right. We need to set them up to perform well the next year, the following year, and so on. So as athletes, it can sometimes, you can feel like you have to battle with your coach. Oh, why are we sticking with this thing for so long or whatever? Well, there's a method behind the madness, and we're trying to make sure you have success over the long term. And if we just beat you over the head with the most intense stimulus, like, a 3-meter drop jump or something, there's nowhere to go from there. And oftentimes athletes' progression in their performance will get capped if they go too intense too soon. So it takes a good quality coach like yourself to guide them along that process, so that way they're doing the right thing at the right time, not jumping ahead too soon, but also not staying in their comfort zone too long,
right?
And molding them like clay in the direction that we want to go over time.
Right. I think kind of sticking to the basics is kind of just a general sense of what I think you're getting at.
Yep.
And, I'm fighting that battle. What are we going to do today? We're going to do this, this, and this. Oh, we've been doing that. Well, yeah. If you want to get good at something, we have to do that thing, and that's going to develop resiliency over time, and it's going to develop their work capacity and their ability to handle load. And so to your point about staying healthy, I think that's important. And not trying to get too fancy and we're going to do 16 or 18 different exercises in a session. Now let's pick low number of high quality exercises and execute them really, really well and do them consistently over time, and not try to, like you said, get to the highest level with that exercise quickly. And taking our time to develop and looking at it as more of a long-term approach, long-term athletic development, which I think, is missed in a lot of high school athletes that just want to do the next best thing immediately and rush into, more weight, different exercises, and not really staying patient and trusting the process and progressively overloading over time. As far as just, strength development in the weight room, it's kind of a battle, that I fight a lot.
Same here.
Yeah. I think to finish, I would love to get you looking at sprint mechanics and kind of breaking down for us and for, those listening, looking at a sprint and from your perspective, what do their mechanics look like? How are they accelerating? What do they need to do to run faster? What are they doing wrong? What are they doing right? So I think I'm going to pull the screen around, and then maybe we'll just look at a couple of sprints, and get your perspective on their mechanics.
Perfect. Let's do it.
Okay. So now that we got the TV set up, you haven't seen these clips.
Nope.
I just want to get your raw reaction on sprint mechanics, acceleration from, youth athletes. Anything you see, good, bad, just kind of take us through what you see or what you think these athletes need to do to get faster.
Okay, cool. So let's take a look at this clip. Initially, one thing that I like is that she's pushing out at a nice aggressive shin angle on that first step. So if you see the angle of her shin right there on this first step, yep, she's pushing in the right direction. So that's what we want to see. Now as this leg comes through, when it comes down to the ground, watch the foot. See how the foot is moving forward into the ground?
Here.
Exactly. How it's coming forward into the ground. So that's a braking motion. Instead, what we want to see is from this high knee position where she's at here, we want to attack down and back under the hip as much as we can.
Way.
Exactly. And if the athlete can't do that from the angle that their whole body is at, that can be sometimes a sign that they're a little too low, they're a little bit too much forward, and we need to come up a little bit so that they can get that attack down into the ground under them with negative foot speed. So positive foot speed would be if your foot was crashing forward into the ground. Negative foot speed is when your foot is coming back. That's what we want, especially in the early steps of acceleration. We want acceleration to be all propulsive, where we're launching ourselves down the track or down the field. So we want to make sure that we're not crashing and braking, slowing ourselves down, especially in these early first few steps. But I really like that she had that positive or that forward shin angle when she pushed out, so that was good. It does look like her shoulders might get a little tight as she goes, which is really common, kind of like see how the shoulder's coming up? Right here, you can see that the shoulder is she's elevating her shoulders as opposed to just swinging at the shoulder.
Right.
So that's one thing coaches, athletes, we want to pay attention to. Sometimes if there's a little too much tension in the system, it can be kind of an emotional thing, like, oh, I don't want to fail, so you get tense, or you're just trying too hard. We want to let the arms swing nice and naturally, nice and relaxed, not have those shoulders come up too much. Once again, foot kind of comes forward into the ground. And this can also be a result of pushing backward too much, because if we push backward too much, if you look at her knee, her foot's already off the ground, right? So we're no longer producing force because her foot's on the ground. At that point, we need this knee to be coming through. We need that hip to flex so the knee comes through. If we push backward for too long, this leg will get stuck back here, and we won't have the time or the space to reorient that limb to the front side to then attack back at the track with that negative foot speed attacking backward down under the hips. So if you feel like you can't get that leg to the front side. You feel like you're almost falling forward and just catching yourself. Sometimes that's a sign that you're pushing for too long. So if you ever feel like you can't get your knees up and you can't get that foot to the front side quick enough, sometimes you're just spending too much time pushing backward, and it skews your timing, because now if her glutes are still trying to extend the leg that way when her foot's off the ground and she's no longer producing force, there's nothing to gain from that. What we need to do is relax all this, flex the hip to the front side so we can then attack back
So
this
that's
way.
switching of the knees.
Exactly.
Switch action. Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
So she's late switching.
Yep. Pushing too long, which causes that late switch.
So you want to push, but you don't want to
Then
push
shut
too
it
long.
off. Exactly.
Push, switch, push,
Yep.
switch.
Timing is a huge aspect of sprinting. It's not just about how much force you produce, it's when you produce it and when you shut those muscles off so you can then switch the limbs and keep applying force to the ground.
So it's a skill, which takes practice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You got to put in the reps. Once again,
Crashing.
foot's coming forward. Shoulders a bit tight. But
Yeah, she's almost shrugging almost
Exactly.
the entire time.
But she has a lot of potential. If she just gets into a slightly higher position, which over time she'll be able to use this angle here effectively, but that just takes time. She just has to get stronger as a result of training, doing more reps. It's going to happen. She clearly has potential, but we just want to make sure that we don't see too much of that crashing action where the knee is like extending, the foot's crashing forward into the ground, trying to keep herself too low, and shrugging in the shoulders.
Yeah.
Those are the main things. But this is much better than a lot of other.
This looks pretty good.
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's
it's
the
already
thing.
pretty good.
It's nitpicking. So there are certain factors we want to really focus on, but it doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that there's things that she has room to improve on, which means she can be faster even if she doesn't get stronger. She can run faster just by fixing those technical things. So if you identify something in your sprinting where you're like, oh, I'm doing that wrong, don't take that as an emotional hit or as something that's bad. That's great, because there's an opportunity. If I look at my times and I see my technique's perfect, which it isn't, but if I did, I'd be like, oh man, well, there's not much I can improve on. I'm probably at my limit. So you want to find these things you can improve on, because those are opportunities to run
it's
faster.
Not a criticism. It's just a coaching point.
Exactly.
Yeah. So takeaways are, she needs to push down and back more, particularly in the first 1, 2, and 3 steps.
And
Relax.
I think one of the things you want to feel as a sprinter is you don't want to just focus on feeling the ground. You want to feel yourself coming off of the ground. If you're too glued to finding the ground, you're going to stay on it, and you're going to keep pushing too long. Instead, you want to feel yourself launch off of the ground. And if she were to launch a little bit more, maybe get a little bit more vertical lift, she might have the time to get that knee there and then attack back. But if you attack and you just go horizontal, gravity's pulling you down. If you don't produce enough force to kind of come up and then down, you're not going to have the time or the space to get that knee to the front side and attack back.
To your point about trying to stay too low.
Yep, exactly.
So that kind of is a visual of maybe staying too low.
Yep.
Yeah.
And instead, you want to kind of feel like you're launching yourself off the ground, attack, launch, attack.
There's a rhythm to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, maybe we look at that other clip.
Yep.
So you scroll to the left a little bit. Yeah, right there.
This one.
So tell us what you see here. Kind of break down this acceleration.
So he has very good switching. See how his posture's rising. It's pretty good. So let's go back here. So he clearly has strong ankles. As you can see, he's pushing through his forefoot. That ankle that's on the ground is staying nice and stable, nice and stiff. He's getting good projection, so his hips are moving across the ground. And you can see he's reached peak hip flexion at the point that his toe is coming off the ground. So now that back leg can start coming through, and that front leg can start attacking down. And that's where the timing comes in, of when one limb is reaching max flexion and the other one's reaching max extension, then we want to switch. And that's what he does really effectively right here. Switching means that back knee is coming forward as that front knee is coming down and back. And that's what we want to see. Hits the ground, that ankle stays pretty stable. It doesn't collapse a lot. He pushes through in a pretty straight angle from his foot all the way up through his spine. He's not shrugging too much in the shoulders. He's attacking aggressively, down and back. See that down and back action right there? It's very subtle.
As opposed to crashing.
Exactly,
this way.
as opposed to waiting for the ground. He's actively driving his foot to the ground as opposed to waiting for it. And that's what we want. We want it to be a very active thing that we're doing. You can see that his knees are pretty much together at touchdown when his foot hits the ground. So that means he's not wasting a lot of time back there in extension. Right when his foot comes off the ground, what's happening? He's flexing that back hip and that knee's coming through. He's not waiting and lagging, keeping his leg behind him, and that's what we want to see.
So just emphasis of front side. Get that back leg to front side
exactly.
as soon as possible right now.
Yeah, let that leg come to the front side. Don't force it behind yourself too long. He could maybe be a little, I'm just a nitpick, could maybe let this elbow come forward a little more, but that's not really a big deal to me. I don't really care too much about that.
In terms of just his arm swing?
Yeah. I care more that the timing between the arms and legs is good and that he's not over-exaggerating the front side or the back side. It's just sort of a balanced swing. That's what I care about more than anything. He's still maintaining that good posture right there.
Letting himself rise up out of the acceleration like we talked about.
Yep. He might push a little longer, or maybe his right hip flexor doesn't produce force quite as quickly on the right side, which is why his knees are more together when the left leg is flexing. See that?
Yep. He's late switching kind of on that right side.
Yeah, and that's something that I deal with too. So that's something that just over time, we all have asymmetries. You can kind of work on it a little bit, but some of that is just kind of how it is.
Pretty good rep overall.
I think it's quite a good rep.
Pretty good rep
I'd be very happy if that's what my athlete was doing. Yeah. You can see he's pushing out aggressively at a horizontal angle, but he's not going so flat that he can't get that foot under him.
Flat, too far, too low this way. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you want to see that switching action, that aggressive, active attack back into the ground, that good posture, and just continue doing that. And if you do that, you're probably going to accelerate pretty well.
Yeah, cool. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to kind of break that down. I think that's really important. A lot of athletes, they don't know what they look like when they're sprinting because they've never actually taken the time to set up. It's not hard to set up a phone, your phone on a cone on the ground or something, and put it in slow mo and watch how they run. Yeah. A lot of times I'll show an athlete how they're running, like, oh, I'm doing that. Yeah. Oh, I look like that. I didn't even know I was doing that. And so I think that's a kind of an easy way to just initially start the process of how do I get faster? Mm-hmm. Well, let me video myself. Yep. Let me video myself sprinting. Let me video myself running. So I'd recommend, just videoing it right at the acceleration and videoing the first 4 to 5 steps, and then maybe videoing after, at 20 or 30 and just videoing the max velocity. Because this is acceleration and max velocity. Different, but similar in many ways, but you get a picture of how you move as an athlete. So I think that's important. So that would be, I guess, maybe the biggest takeaway from this is video yourself sprinting so you know what you look like, and then you can start to figure out what you need to do to get faster and what you can fix to improve your speed. Yeah, and don't be afraid to look for those things that you can improve on, those technical errors, so to speak, because those are opportunities. It's not something bad that you're doing. It's room for you to improve. So be open to that. Be happy that you can find those things, because that means it's something that's within your control that you can fix, and then you can run faster. Cool. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to come out here. I thought that was great. I think athletes and parents are going to get a lot out of this. So I appreciate you taking the time. For sure, man. Thanks for having me. Thank you.